The wreckage lay scattered across the coral beach of Saipan, twisted metal glinting under the Pacific sun. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda stood before what remained of an American F6F Hellcat, his engineering team already prying open access panels with careful precision. It was the morning of July 23, 1944, and the war had just delivered something more valuable than 100 prisoners, an intact enemy fighter with all its secrets exposed. Genda ran his hand along the Hellcat's torn fuselage, noting the armor plating, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the robust construction that allowed this aircraft to absorb punishment that would have shredded a Zero. But it was what his lead technician discovered behind the instrument panel that would change everything. A compact black box, roughly the size of a large radio, connected to a small dish antenna mounted in the fighter's nose. Genda didn't recognize it. Within 3 weeks, he would understand that he was holding the answer to the question that haunted every surviving Japanese naval aviator. Why had 600 of their aircraft vanished from the sky in just 8 weeks? If you're enjoying this deep dive into this story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The numbers defied explanation. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th, 1944, Japanese carrier aviation had simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had launched Operation Eigo with 473 carrier aircraft, the concentrated striking power of 9 carriers, supported by additional land-based air groups from the Marianas. The Americans called what followed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it something far less colorful in their after-action reports, a catastrophe that ended their carrier war forever. The official figures, compiled painstakingly by Japanese naval staff in the months that followed, told a story that seemed impossible. Of those 473 carrier aircraft launched, only 35 returned to their ships. 300 aircraft losses in 2 days. When combined with land-based losses from the Marianas airfields, Japanese records documented over 600 aircraft destroyed in the broader Philippine Sea operation. Against this, American losses stood at 123 aircraft. Most lost not to enemy action but to operational causes during a desperate night recovery. The kill ratio was so lopsided it appeared to violate the fundamental mathematics of air combat. Even accounting for American numerical superiority, the numbers didn't make sense. Japanese pilots who survived, and there were precious few, reported being intercepted with impossible consistency. American fighters appeared at altitude, already positioned for attack, as if they possessed foreknowledge of every Japanese approach. Combat air patrols found Japanese formations with uncanny precision. Night attacks, once a Japanese advantage, now resulted in slaughter as American fighters hunted in darkness with apparent ease. In the aftermath, Japanese command constructed explanations built on everything except the truth. Pilot quality had degraded, they concluded, as the veteran aviators of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea died one by one, replaced by hastily trained recruits with perhaps 1/3 the flight hours of their predecessors. American numbers overwhelmed Japanese formations through sheer mass. Fuel shortages degraded performance. The loss of experienced air control officers disrupted coordination. Zero fighters, optimized for the war's early years, now faced opponents designed specifically to kill them. All of these factors contained elements of truth. Japanese pilot training had indeed suffered catastrophic decline, as the war consumed experienced instructors faster than they could be replaced. American industrial production had achieved levels that Japanese planners in 1941 had dismissed as propaganda fantasy. The Hellcat was undeniably a better aircraft than the Zero for the brutal attrition warfare the Pacific had become. But none of these explanations addressed the central mystery. How did American fighters consistently achieve positional advantage before visual contact? How did they find Japanese formations in weather that should have provided concealment? How did they intercept with such precision that Japanese commanders began suspecting radio intelligence breaches or even traitors? The answer lay in Genda's hands on that July morning in Saipan, though he didn't yet comprehend it. The black box his technicians extracted from the Hellcat's nose was an AN/APS-4 airborne intercept radar, a technology that had quietly revolutionized American naval aviation while Japanese engineers remained focused on perfecting the maneuverability and range of their fighters. It represented not merely a technological advantage, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of air combat itself. What Japanese pilots experienced as inexplicable American luck was actually physics, electromagnetic radiation bouncing off aircraft at ranges where human eyes saw only empty sky. To understand why this small device proved so devastating required understanding what Japanese naval aviation believed about fighter combat in 1944. The Zero's design philosophy, perfected by Jiro Horikoshi in the late 1930s, prioritized three characteristics above all others: range, maneuverability, and climb rate. To achieve these qualities, Horikoshi stripped away everything deemed unnecessary. No armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armament by American standards. The result was an aircraft that could outmaneuver anything in the sky, reach combat areas 500 miles from its carrier, and climb to altitude faster than any opponent. This design reflected a broader Japanese doctrine that emphasized pilot skill and fighting spirit over technological systems. A superior pilot in a maneuverable aircraft would defeat an inferior pilot in a better protected but less agile machine. Visual identification and engagement would determine combat outcomes. Radio communication existed but remained primitive compared to American systems, with most tactical coordination happening through visual signals. The idea of detecting an enemy before seeing him with your own eyes was largely theoretical, explored in laboratory settings, but considered impractical for operational use. Japanese engineers were not ignorant of radar technology. Ground-based radar systems had been developed, though production remained limited by industrial constraints and a general skepticism about electronic warfare from traditionally minded officers. Airborne radar had been discussed, but the technical challenges of miniaturizing equipment for fighter installation, combined with doubts about its tactical value, meant such programs received low priority. Why burden a fighter with heavy electronics when superior pilot skill and aircraft performance would decide engagements? The Americans had made a different calculation. By 1943, the United States Navy had begun installing radar systems in specialized night fighter variants of the F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair. The AN/APS-4 radar could detect large aircraft at ranges up to 8 miles, smaller targets at 4 to 5 miles, distances at which visual identification remained impossible, except under perfect conditions. More importantly, the radar could penetrate weather, darkness, and haze that rendered human eyesight useless. A Hellcat pilot with working radar could find his target when a Zero pilot saw only clouds. But radar alone didn't explain the Philippine Sea disaster. The full picture required understanding how Americans integrated radar into their carrier air defense system. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers used ship-based radar to track incoming raids, then vectored combat air patrols to intercept coordinates via radio. The Hellcat pilots, equipped with their own airborne radar and superior radios, could fine-tune their approach in the final miles, achieving altitude advantage and optimal attack position before the enemy even knew they were there. The Japanese never saw their attackers until it was too late because the Americans weren't relying on seeing the Japanese. This integration of radar and radio communication created an information advantage so profound It might as well have been magic from a Japanese perspective. American fighters operated within a network of electronic awareness that stretched from carrier radar rooms to cockpit displays. Japanese fighters operated in isolation, each pilot's awareness limited to what his eyes could see and what fragmentary radio calls he might receive on unreliable equipment. The Americans were fighting a 1944 war. The Japanese were still fighting a 1942 war, and the tactical environment had shifted beneath them. Genda understood none of this on July 23rd. His team catalogued the Hellcat's robust construction, its powerful engine, its heavy armament of 6 50-caliber machine guns that could shred a Zero with a single burst. They noted the armor behind the pilot's seat, the protected fuel tanks that could absorb hits without exploding. They examined the radio equipment, more sophisticated than anything in Japanese service. But the black box in the nose remained a mystery. It had wiring too complex for simple radio equipment. The small rotating dish antenna served no obvious purpose. When technicians powered up the salvaged electrical system and the device hummed to life, its cathode ray display showed dancing green lines that meant nothing to observers trained in conventional instruments. It took 3 days to find someone who understood what they were looking at. A civilian engineer, previously employed by Japan Radio Company and now attached to naval intelligence, examined the equipment and went pale. He had seen similar laboratory equipment in Tokyo, experimental systems being developed for ground use. But here it was, miniaturized, ruggedized, installed in a frontline fighter as standard equipment. The Americans had solved problems Japanese engineers considered years away from practical solutions. They had crossed a technological threshold that Japan, for all its early war successes, could not follow. The engineer powered up the system again, this time understanding the display. The radar was still functional despite the crash. He carried it outside, aimed it at a transport ship anchored in Saipan's harbor, and watched a bright return echo appear on the screen. Range, approximately 3 miles, the ship clearly visible on the display despite heat haze that made visual identification difficult. He swept the antenna across the sky. Nothing, then a faint return. A patrol aircraft at perhaps 4 miles, invisible to the naked eye in the glare and distance. The engineer turned to Genda with an expression that mixed professional admiration and existential dread. The Americans weren't just seeing them coming. They were seeing them when the Japanese were blind. Genda requested immediate transport to Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, where more sophisticated testing facilities existed. The Hellcat wreckage, particularly the radar system, was crated with unusual care and shipped aboard a fast destroyer to Japan's home islands. By early August 1944, a dedicated team of engineers and naval aviators had assembled to understand exactly what advantage this technology conferred and, more urgently, whether Japanese forces could counter it or develop equivalent systems before American carrier groups reached the Philippines. The testing process began with technical dissection. Engineers measured every component, traced every circuit, photographed every assembly. The AN-APS-4 used a cavity magnetron as its transmitter, a device that Japanese researchers understood in theory, but had never successfully miniaturized for aircraft use. The receiver's circuitry demonstrated sophisticated techniques for amplifying weak return signals while filtering out noise. The antenna assembly, mounted in a streamlined nose fairing, could be rotated by the pilot to scan different sectors. The entire system weighed approximately 100 pounds, substantial but not prohibitive for an aircraft designed from the start to carry such equipment. What impressed Japanese engineers most was not the individual components but their integration. The radar display was positioned for easy pilot reference without dominating the instrument panel. Controls were simple enough for operation in combat conditions. The system drew power from the aircraft's electrical system without overwhelming it. Most tellingly, the installation showed signs of mass production. Standardized mounting brackets, consistent wiring harnesses, replaceable modules. This wasn't an experimental prototype. It was production equipment, installed in operational fighters as a matter of course. How many Hellcats carried such systems? If the Americans were installing radar in fighters as standard equipment, what did that imply about their industrial capacity and technological sophistication? The next phase involved operational testing. Japanese pilots flew captured American aircraft when available, but the Saipan Hellcat was too damaged for flight. Instead, engineers mounted the radar system in a test aircraft to evaluate its practical utility. A Mitsubishi G4M bomber, chosen for its spacious interior, received the radar installation. Test flights began in late August, with experienced pilots evaluating what advantage the system provided in realistic tactical scenarios. The results were sobering. Even in daylight, clear conditions, the radar detected other aircraft at ranges where visual identification remained impossible. The pilot knew where to look, could estimate range and bearing, could plan his approach to achieve optimal attack position. In marginal weather, light haze, scattered clouds, the advantage became overwhelming. Targets invisible to eyesight appeared clearly on the radar screen. At night, the technology transformed a blind man's grope into precise intercept geometry. One test pilot, a veteran of the early carrier battles, flew a radar-equipped intercept against a Zero playing the target role. He achieved perfect attack position without ever seeing his target visually until entering firing range. His report was brief and damning. With this equipment, pilot skill becomes secondary to electronics. The American who sees us first kills us first. He always sees us first. Cross-referencing battle reports from the Philippine Sea with this new understanding proved devastating. Incident after incident, previously attributed to bad luck or American numerical superiority, suddenly made terrible sense. Japanese formations intercepted during their approach to the American carriers. The Hellcats had been vectored by shipboard radar and used their own airborne sets to refine their intercept. Japanese dive bombers found by combat air patrols despite approaching through scattered clouds. The weather that should have concealed them was transparent to radar. Japanese night attacks that simply vanished, their aircraft failing to return with no explanation. American night fighters had hunted them in darkness with electronic eyes. The most haunting reanalysis concerned the strike wave launched on June 19th at approximately 10 in the morning, a formation of 69 aircraft attacking the American carriers. American combat air patrols had intercepted them 40 miles from their targets, achieving altitude advantage and position for classic diving attacks. Japanese survivors reported being bounced repeatedly, American fighters appearing from above and behind with perfect coordination. At the time, this had been attributed to luck or possibly traitor radio operators broadcasting Japanese positions. Now the explanation became clear. The Americans had tracked the formation on shipboard radar from the moment it came within range, vectored multiple Hellcat divisions to intercept coordinates, and those Hellcat pilots had used their own radar to refine their approach in the final miles. The Japanese had been visible on American screens for 30 minutes before visual contact. They had flown into a precisely orchestrated ambush, never suspecting that electronics had stripped away their concealment. Genda compiled his findings into a report that reached Combined Fleet Headquarters in early September 1944. His conclusions were technical, detailed, and merciless in their implications. The Americans possessed a systematic advantage in detection and intercept that no amount of pilot courage or tactical sophistication could overcome. Japanese fighters were engaging opponents who already held positional advantage before the fight began. Attempting to attack American carrier groups meant flying into a defensive network that could see you coming from dozens of miles away and coordinate intercepts with precision impossible using visual methods alone. The kill ratios at Philippine Sea were not aberrations. They were the predictable result of fighting an electronically enabled enemy while relying on techniques developed for an earlier war. The report triggered immediate questions. Could Japan develop equivalent systems? Could countermeasures defeat American radar? Could tactical changes mitigate the advantage? The answers ranged from discouraging to catastrophic. Japanese electronics industry could theoretically produce airborne radar systems, but doing so would require diverting resources from other critical war production. At a time when aluminum, copper, and skilled labor were already desperately scarce. Even if production began immediately, equipping the fighter force would take years. The Americans had a multi-year head start, and their industrial capacity meant they could iterate and improve their systems faster than Japan could copy them. Countermeasures offered little hope. Chaff, metal strips dropped to create false radar returns, might confuse American radar. But Japan lacked the production capacity to manufacture chaff in meaningful quantities. Electronic jamming required equipment and understanding Japan didn't possess. Simply flying low to avoid radar detection was impractical for carrier strikes that needed to maintain formation and conserve fuel. Every tactical solution carried costs that eroded combat effectiveness in other ways. The most viable approach was tactical adaptation, attacking at night when American radar advantage would be reduced, using weather for concealment when possible, approaching from unexpected angles to complicate American intercept geometry. But these were marginal improvements, attempts to minimize disadvantage rather than achieve parity. The fundamental imbalance remained. American fighters could find Japanese formations before being found. That advantage, compounded by superior radios for coordination and more robust aircraft that could survive damage, created a combat environment where Japanese losses would continue to exceed replacements, regardless of pilot skill or tactical creativity. Genda's report circulated among senior naval aviators and strategists throughout September and October 1944. Reactions varied from denial to despair. Some officers refused to believe that electronic equipment could provide such decisive advantage, insisting that proper tactics and fighting spirit would overcome technological deficiency. Others recognized immediately that carrier aviation as Japan practiced it had become obsolete. The argument about whether to believe the report became moot in late October, when American carrier groups returned to strike the Philippines and Japanese forces suffered another catastrophic defeat. The Battle of Leyte Gulf included extensive air operations around the Philippine Islands, and the results confirmed every conclusion in Genda's report. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 400 during the multi-day battle, while American carrier air groups maintained effective strength despite intense operations. Japanese pilots reported the same pattern. American fighters appearing at advantageous positions, intercepts occurring with suspicious precision, night operations resulting in disproportionate losses. The Americans weren't getting lucky. They were executing a systematic destruction enabled by technology that let them fight a different kind of war. By November 1944, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a conventional fighting force. The carrier fleet, such as it remained, lacked sufficient aircraft and trained pilots to conduct meaningful strikes. Land-based air groups in the Philippines were being attrited faster than replacements could arrive. The decision to employ kamikaze tactics, deliberate suicide attacks using aircraft as guided missiles, reflected this reality. If Japanese pilots couldn't survive long enough to press conventional attacks, perhaps accepting certain death while achieving a single hit offered better mathematics than futile attempts at orthodox combat that resulted in death without damage to the enemy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The captured Hellcat radar remained at Yokosuka Arsenal, an artifact of Japanese failure to anticipate how war at sea would evolve. Engineers continued studying it throughout late 1944 and into 1945, not because they believed Japan could still develop equivalent systems in time to matter, but because understanding the enemy's capabilities remained professionally necessary. The device represented more than mere technological superiority. It embodied a different approach to warfare, one that integrated industrial capacity, scientific research, and tactical doctrine into systems that multiplied combat effectiveness beyond what individual courage or skill could achieve. Some Japanese aviation personnel never accepted this analysis. They attributed losses to inadequate training, material shortages, numerical inferiority, anything except the possibility that American electronics had rendered Japanese tactical doctrine obsolete. The pride that had driven early war successes became an obstacle to understanding why those successes could not be repeated. Admitting that a black box full of circuitry could decide air battles felt like betraying the Bushido spirit that defined Japanese military culture. Better to die fighting conventionally than admit that fighting spirit had become subordinate to technology. Others understood immediately, and carried that understanding as a terrible burden. They had sent pilots into battle against opponents who possessed invisible advantages that Japanese commanders hadn't even suspected existed. How many of those 600 aircraft lost at Philippine Sea had died not from inferior skill or inadequate courage, but from never having a chance? How many pilots had been intercepted and killed by enemies they never saw, enemies who had tracked them electronically from beyond visual range, and achieved attack position before the Japanese even knew the fight had begun? The psychological impact extended beyond professional embarrassment. Japanese naval aviation had defined itself through the quality of its pilots and the excellence of its aircraft design. The Zero, despite its vulnerabilities, remained a manifestation of that philosophy. An aircraft that trusted pilot, skill over technological systems, that chose maneuverability over protection, that embodied a belief in human excellence as the decisive factor in combat. Learning that Americans had bypassed this entire philosophy by making the first sight electronic rather than visual felt like learning the rules of war had been rewritten without notice. Post-war interrogations of Japanese aviation personnel by United States Strategic Bombing Survey investigators documented this psychological dimension. When asked why Japanese forces hadn't developed airborne radar earlier, the responses varied from technical explanations about miniaturization challenges to more fundamental admissions that radar simply hadn't seemed like a priority compared to perfecting aircraft performance and pilot training. One former carrier division commander, when shown photographs of Hellcat radar installations, asked quietly how many American fighters had carried such equipment. When told that radar had become standard in night fighters and increasingly common in day fighters by mid-1944, he sat in silence for several minutes before responding that he had sent his pilots to die against an enemy they couldn't even see. The disparity in approach reflected broader differences in how each nation prosecuted the war. American industry could afford to install 100-pound radar systems in fighters because American industrial capacity was producing fighters faster than combat could destroy them. American doctrine emphasized technological solutions to tactical problems because American scientific and industrial resources made such solutions achievable. American naval aviation could afford to train pilots extensively because American training infrastructure wasn't being bombed and American fuel supplies weren't dependent on vulnerable tanker routes. Every advantage compounded every other advantage, creating a systemic superiority that individual technical fixes couldn't overcome. Japan's situation was precisely opposite. Every pound of weight in an aircraft meant trade-offs elsewhere because aluminum was scarce. Every technological system required manufacturing capacity needed for producing basic weapons. Every pilot in training consumed fuel Japan could barely afford to allocate. The decision to prioritize aircraft performance over electronic systems wasn't simply conservative thinking. It reflected resource constraints that made complex technological integration nearly impossible, even if Japanese engineers had fully appreciated radar's value earlier in the war. But understanding these structural differences didn't change the tactical reality Japanese pilots faced in late 1944. American fighters could see them first. That advantage proved decisive in engagement after engagement. The mathematics of air combat shifted fundamentally when one side possessed electronic awareness and the other relied on eyesight alone. Japanese tactical adaptations, flying lower, attacking at night, using weather, helped at the margins but couldn't overcome the core imbalance. The radar-equipped Hellcat remained superior to the Zero, not merely because it was faster or better armed or more protective, but because its pilot possessed information unavailable to his opponent. The consequences extended beyond immediate combat losses. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the Philippine Sea disaster. The loss of 600 aircraft, and more critically, hundreds of trained pilots and air crews, created gaps that could not be filled given Japan's attrition rate and training limitations. Subsequent battles consumed replacements faster than they arrived. By early 1945, Japan's ability to contest American carrier operations had deteriorated to the point where American task forces operated with near impunity off the Japanese home islands, their radar-equipped fighters maintaining air superiority that made conventional defense nearly impossible. The captured Hellcat radar at Yokosuka Arsenal survived the war. American occupation forces found it during their survey of Japanese military research facilities, documented it in technical reports, and eventually repatriated it to the United States. Japanese engineers who had studied it were interviewed extensively about their findings and conclusions. Their analysis had been accurate, their understanding of what the technology meant tactically precise. They had simply learned the truth too late to act on it, and even if they had learned earlier, Japan's industrial and resource limitations would have made meaningful response nearly impossible. Genda survived the war and eventually served in Japan's post-war self-defense forces, rising to command the Air Self-Defense Force in the 1960s. In occasional interviews and writings about the war, he returned repeatedly to the lesson of the captured Hellcat radar, that modern warfare had become a contest of systems, not merely individual weapons or warrior qualities. The side that integrated technology, industrial capacity, training, and doctrine into coherent operational systems would defeat the side that treated each element in isolation. Japanese naval aviation had been excellent at building maneuverable fighters and training skilled pilots. Americans had been better at building an entire system that made those individual excellences subordinate to collective advantage. The 600 aircraft lost in 8 weeks represented more than tactical defeat. They marked the end of an era in naval aviation warfare, the moment when electronic awareness became as important as visual acuity, when information advantage proved as decisive as firepower or maneuverability. The Japanese pilots who died never knew they were flying against enemies who could see in the dark, who could peer through clouds, who possessed an electronic sixth sense that made traditional combat tactics obsolete. They died brave and skilled, but they died ill, at a disadvantage so profound that no amount of courage could overcome it. The small black box Lieutenant Commander Genda held on that July morning in Saipan embodied this transformation. It weighed approximately 100 pounds, consumed several hundred watts of power, could detect aircraft at ranges measured in single-digit miles. By modern standards, it was primitive, barely functional. but in the context of 1944 air combat, it represented a revolution as profound as the introduction of radar itself to naval warfare. It made the invisible visible, the unknown knowable. It transformed air combat from a contest of pilot against pilot into a contest of system against system, where the side with better information killed the side that remained ignorant. Those 600 Zeros and their pilots died, learning this lesson one engagement at a time, never understanding why American fighters appeared so consistently at advantageous positions, why intercepts occurred with such precision, why the hunt that should have been mutual became systematic slaughter. The answer sat in wreckage on a Saipan beach, waiting for Japanese engineers to recognize what they were seeing and understand what it meant. By the time they achieved that understanding, the battle was already lost, the war already decided. The radar hadn't just helped kill 600 aircraft in 8 weeks. It had killed an entire approach to naval aviation warfare, made obsolete a doctrine that had dominated the Pacific for nearly 3 years, and demonstrated that modern war would be won by those who mastered not just weapons, but the systems that made weapons decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.